today we're going to talk about the Pilgrims, and we're going to be taking it from a vantage point not of the Thanksgiving Day celebration and what actually happened in the Thanksgiving Day celebration, or the fact that the Thanksgiving Day celebration probably was their kind of idea of the fall harvest feasts that we've studied, the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, and that it was kind of similar to that. But we're going to focus on the hardship that they endured to come over to the United States, to the New World. And we're going to also look at how God had actually prepared this place for them so that they could survive and eventually thrive in the New World. And so this is so it's really I feel like it's so many events that just happen at some of the events are just the right, precise time, which enabled the Pilgrims to survive and to come into the United States. So we're going to look at all of that. So, the Pilgrims and God's sovereignty in making America. I pulled out a verse for you out of Revelation. I'm not saying that this is the fulfillment of that verse. It's verse 12, or chapter 12, verses 4 to 6. But what I am saying is that I see a lot of times in Revelation and even in other areas of the Bible where prophecies or things that God had dictated ended up occurring, where God uses sort of a pattern of dealing with the human race. And I see that same pattern here. For example, the Israelites left Egypt. They went into the wilderness. They were going to a place that God had prepared for them, the land of Canaan. Okay, this is speaking primarily to the end times, but also you would see a fulfillment in this when the Christians left Jerusalem in 70 A.D., or was it 67? Somewhere between 67 and 70 A.D., the Roman army had surrounded Jerusalem, and then they had retreated. Right? And when they retreated, all the Christians left because Jesus said, when you see this city surrounded, get out. Which didn't make any sense, but as we know from history, the Roman army came, and then they left, and then they came again. And when they came again, you weren't getting out that time. But the Christians left because of what Jesus had said. And they went to the wilderness. So what you see with what was happening with the Pilgrims at the time is they were being persecuted. Their wilderness was the Atlantic Ocean, and then coming into the new land was the land being prepared for them. So let's look at some of the events that happened right prior to, or within 100 years or so prior to the Pilgrims, 150 years to the Pilgrims coming to the United States. So one of the big events that happened was the fall of Constantinople with the Ottomans. And I'm going to show you on this slide right here. The Ottoman Empire, Constantinople's right about here, in between this kind of land bridge right here, in Turkey, what we know in modern-day Turkey anyhow. So the fall of Constantinople allowed them to continue to get all of this landmass right here. And if you look, you can see that Europe was on the verge of being overrun by the Ottoman Empire. And it was a very harrowing time for the Europeans. Meanwhile, in 1456, the Gutenberg Press figured out a way to mass produce the Bible, and it began printing it in 1456. And this led to an awful lot of enlightenment occurring in Europe. In 1492, so within, what was that, about 40 years or so? Within 40 years, Columbus discovered America. And that was very important because at that time what that made was that made Spain one of the richest, which was already rich and powerful, by the way, and it was a Catholic nation, okay? But it made them even more rich and powerful because they ended up finding a lot of gold in America. Not North America, but Central and South America they found it in. And it turned them into one of the greatest naval powers in Europe. Now, the other power in Europe was France, which was a land power, and then Great Britain was, because of the English Channel They kind of had a little bit of a barrier between them, so they were able to maintain their sovereignty. But these nations were constantly at war with each other. So in 1517, you had the Protestant Reformation initiated by Martin Luther. Mm-hmm. It's no accident that the Gutenberg Press had initiated this thoughts where people had begun reading the Bible and began to understand it and realized a lot of the things that were being taught by the Roman Catholic Church at that time were just wrong.
Right.
And so that the Roman Catholic Church needed to be reformed. So that's what the Reformation is. But eventually the Reformation, decided they needed to depart from the Roman Catholic Church. Yes, Javon?
I'm learning about the fall of Constantinople
To the Ottomans?
Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm glad I could help out a little bit. So, in 1526, the Tyndale Bible was printed in English. And this was, printing these Bibles in any other language other than Latin was considered to be heresy. And you would be killed for doing this. Okay? So the Tyndale Bible being produced in English was a major issue. Now, King Henry VIII we all know about King Henry VIII, right? He liked to eat those big drumsticks, and he chased all the ladies, right?
Yeah.
That's what we typically know about him. He was big and fat too, right? Yeah. Actually, King Henry VIII was about 6'4", and he was incredibly athletic for his time, very athletic. And his goal in life was to become a conqueror. And he never really had a chance to become, he wanted to be this great king conqueror, and he never really had a chance and really didn't win any substantial battles to do that. So, and then the other big goal that he had in his life was to have an heir to the throne, a son. And that was problematic because he kept having children, but they were either dying or females. And finally, he did end up having a son, and that son was sickly, and he took the crown for a couple of years, but not many. As it turns out, several of his daughters ended up becoming the sovereigns of England. But because of the problem that he couldn't have a son, and they didn't realize that it was all the man's fault. They didn't realize it's the man's fault that you can't have a son. They thought it was the female's fault. He wanted to put his wives away, and the Roman Catholic Church, sometimes they would take bribes and they would do that kind of stuff. But eventually they were fighting him on it, and so he left the Roman Catholic Church. He said, "You're no longer the head of the church here in England. I'm the head of the church in England." And all of that was driven by the fact that he wanted to leave his wife. Whichever wife it was, it might have been Catherine. I think it was actually Catherine. Now I think about it, because her cousin was the emperor of Europe also. So King Henry VIII, he ended up leaving his wife, and he took on another wife, and the reason why he did this was because he wanted to have a son, and so he thought he would have a son with this other wife, and this continued to happen. That's why he kept going from wife to wife to wife, because he was somebody who ran around with women. It didn't matter who he was married to, okay? But he needed to have a legal wife to have the child, and that's why he kept getting divorced, or, in Anne Boleyn's case, beheaded his wife. So he breaks with Rome and he starts the Church of England, okay? So now we know where the Church of England comes from. And the Episcopalian Church of today is pretty much derived out of the Church of England. If you go there, you'll see a lot of things that kind of look Roman Catholic, and yet they're Protestant. But they lean kind of in between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. So the Cloverdale Bible was then printed in English, and that was because the Tyndale Bible was getting into the land, and people were reading it, and this was like an unauthorized version. So I think eventually King Henry realized, who was actually named as the defender of the faith by the Pope, 20 years or 30 years prior to that, when he was defending Catholicism, but now he was against Catholicism, and he thought, you know what, this is something I could stick my name to and be honored for, so that I'm going to say that this Bible is the legitimate Bible, and I'm going to authorize it, and it can be printed, and it'll be in our churches. So the Cloverdale Bible was finally initiated. So interestingly, King Henry's transgressions and ways of living his life, which was many of them very sinful, God was able to use for good and to get the Word of God out into England. And by getting the Word of God out into England, that's what helped to create the Puritans, who wanted to purify the Church of England and remove all the Roman Catholicism and the incense and the idols and all the things that were inside the church still out of the Church of England. Okay? Wanted to remove that. But eventually, after about 50 years of trying to do that, the Pilgrims began to form, and they were originally known as the Separatists because they were like, no matter what, we're not going to be able to reform this church because it's just not happening. So we need to go find a church of our own. Anyhow, Mary Tudor became, this is a Tudor family, King Henry Tudor, by the way. So Mary Tudor became the next monarch, and she persecuted the Protestants. And there was about 300 of them, 300 Protestants that died under her reign. She also, at that time, had taken Elizabeth and put her into a place where she could keep an eye on her to make sure there wasn't a revolt or a coup started in her name. What was happening prior to all of this was whichever group was in charge tended to persecute the group that wasn't in charge. That goes for the Protestants also. Okay? It appears, but however, a lot of our history may have been written by Protestants. It appears that the Protestants weren't quite as ruthless as the Catholics and maybe semi-tolerant to the Catholics. However, it was pretty ruthless, especially by today's standards. If we looked at it by today's standards, we'd say they were all ruthless. By their standards, that was the way of life. When you were persecuted, you were burned at the stake. If you were a terrible heretic, you had your head cut off and you were quartered. They cut you into 4 different parts, and then they sent you to different parts of the city or the country, so that people would realize how terrible you were for your beliefs. And this was basically Christian on Christian. Anyhow, she didn't last very long. Eventually, Queen Elizabeth came into power, and her reign was probably one of the longest reigns that England's ever seen. And she was Mary Tudor. I believe that her mother was Catherine the Great, Catherine, and Queen Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn. Which Anne Boleyn is such an interesting person if you ever get a chance to read about her in history. She was incredibly smart. So let's look at Queen Elizabeth's slide here. Or not her slide, but just kind of give you like the timeline there of, the different things that are going on. Oh, young Edward, that's the one that was in between, that's the one that's in between Tudor and Mary Tudor and Elizabeth, right? But you see how all these things just happened like right before the Pilgrims. By the way, I have maps and, charts and stuff like that. I didn't want to print those out. I didn't want to use all my ink. Sorry. So we're going with slides today because I wanted to enhance the presentation for you, though. So then, meanwhile, there's this other war that's happening between the Netherlands, and Spain. The Netherlands belonged to Spain. They were kind of like a province or a colony. They weren't actually like there, but they belonged to them, right? And they allowed them to kind of rule themselves, and they paid these heavy taxes, okay? Well, they had this war called the War of Independence, the Dutch War of Independence, or the 80 Years' War, and it appeared to happen in like 2 40-year segments is where it happened. So the first 40 years was from 1566 to 1609, and then there was 12 years of truce. And then the next 40 years that they had the war again was in 1621. And eventually the Netherlands received their independence, and they became a pretty substantial force to be reckoned with, and were also very helpful, by the way, in the American Revolution, and especially in some of the areas of helping to finance. So, looking at that, remember that date, 1621, is the resumption of the war. Meanwhile, we have the Battle of Lepanto. Well, the Battle of Lepanto was, you remember the Ottoman Empire had grown now because it had taken over Constantinople, and then it began to proceed and grab more land in Eastern Europe, right? Southeastern Europe. So in the Battle of Lepanto, this was a battle that happened, it was a major battle that happened just right around Corinth, Greece is where it happened at.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had the army of all of the Ottoman Turks against a confederation of the European armies, which was led by Spain. And they actually were beginning to lose this battle, but the wind had changed in the course of the battle. In the middle of the battle, the direction of the wind had changed in favor of the Europeans, and the Europeans ended up winning this battle. And what that did was that stopped the Ottomans from continuing to encroach into Europe and eventually the whole world probably becoming a Muslim empire. Okay? So that stopped that whole thing. Well, what happened then, too, was, one superpower's now been diminished and another one's created. We already talked about, Spain that had the New World. They had this amazing fleet. And now they had just beaten, the number 2 or number 1 superpower. So they're the number 1 superpower, at least on the ocean. Okay? Nobody can compete with them. And they're building these ships that are like huge hotels. I mean, they're just huge. They got cannons everywhere, right? And so then the king decides to create what's called the Spanish Armada. And instead of continuing to free areas of Europe and retake over places, he decides he wants to attack England.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's Catholic, as is France, but England's Protestant. And they don't like that Protestant Reformation happening over there, so he's going to take over England. So he sails up to England with 130 ships and 1,500 guns and 1,000 iron guns and thousands and thousands of soldiers. And Queen Elizabeth herself goes to the shoreline where this battle is happening. And this is what she says. She says, "Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and the goodwill of my subjects. I have come among you resolved in the midst of the heat of this battle to live or die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdoms and for my people my honor and my blood even in the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and the stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. By your valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over these enemies of God, of my kingdom, and of my people." It's almost like what you're seeing here is like a David and Goliath scenario, right? You got the Queen of England, on a horse, decked out in her armor, ready to fight. Well, they're going against these huge ships with these little tiny ships.
Yep.
Okay, and so what they did have with the little tiny ships is they had speed on their side, and so it made it difficult. And so they did have an initial battle, and then the Spanish ships, they pulled out and they anchored off the coast because guess what? The weather had turned really bad. The waves are building up. The winds are storming out, right? So they said, okay, we need to pull these are big ships. So I'm telling you, the waves and the wind must have been pretty serious to do this, right? We need to pull all these ships together. We're going to tie them together. So they tie all those ships together. And Francis Drake's looking over from England. He's like, I can't believe what I'm seeing here. All those ships are tied together. We're going to send some fire ships in the middle of the night. They send some fire ships across the harbor and start catching the ships on fire. Well, the ships are all made of wood. Right? And so they're catching on fire. They cut loose all these lines, and now, the wind and the waves are taking them whichever way. It's just chaos for them. And they continue to battle them all the way around England, and eventually, because of the winds, they couldn't come back the way that they had came through the English Sea Channel. They had to actually go up and around England. Well, when they went up and around England, they hit another storm that was even worse, and it sank even more of their ships. So by the time that he was done, they had lost 56 ships, and 10 ships were scuttled, and over 20,000 people were either dead from the battle or storms or disease. And this was basically their route. They came here. This is where they kind of had their battle, and then they went through here, and this is where they hit all those other storms, and they came back. Meanwhile, in the New World, there's this guy named Thomas Hunt who takes several of the Winnipeg Indians, which are the Indians in the exact area that the Pilgrims are going to end up landing in. It isn't the area that they were thinking they were going to land in. They thought they were going to land in the Hudson Bay area, which is what their charter had said, right? Mm-hmm. But what he does is he takes he captures a bunch of those Indians, and he takes them, and he's going to sell them as slaves. And one of the slaves that he captures is named Squanto. And Squanto then goes back with him. And we'll get into Squanto's travels in a little bit. But in the meantime, within 2 years after Squanto is captured and taken off of the coast, okay, they have what they call the Pawtuxet Plague, which wiped out all of the Indians in that area, which also would have wiped out Squanto, which many believe, including William Bradford, who was the person we get most of our information from on Plymouth Plantation, I believe he calls his book, that they wouldn't have survived their first winter if it hadn't been for Squanto. So, what happened, though, they believe, is that there was a shipwreck, and the tribe had actually captured. This was a French shipwreck. The tribe had actually captured these French people, and so they took them ashore, and they saved their life. Or they had the shipwreck. They went ashore. They had these provisions. When the Indians heard of it, they surrounded them, and they never left watching and dogging them. So they took advantage of it and killed all but 3 or 4 of them, whom they kept. And they sent from one Sachem to another, making sport of them and using them worse than slaves. So while they were making sport of them and using them and abusing them, apparently these people had also carried a disease that the Indians were not immune to. And it ended up, probably smallpox, yeah, but we don't know. But it ended up wiping out the entire area. Not only did it wipe out the entire tribe and the entire area, and this area was now cleared for land, and it was a farming area, and so it was a perfect area to move into. It's like you didn't have to clear all the trees and everything. But not only did it wipe out the entire area, but the other Indians were so afraid of that area that they thought that it was filled with evil spirits, and they would not go into the area. So the area was completely left open after this. It's just amazing. And then in 1619, which is right before the Pilgrims land in the New World, Squanto manages to obtain his release from England and comes back to his land only to find that his tribe is dead. And so this is the area right here where that tribe was at. And that tribe became incredibly hostile towards English because of things like this person taking slaves. And so they were, if anybody landed on that shoreline, they were going to get killed and dogged just like the French had been. Mm-hmm. However, they were wiped out. And you see that this is, right here is Plymouth right there. Mm-hmm. That's exactly where the Pilgrims ended up landing. Then with Squanto, this is an interesting slide. His travels began in 1605, where he was kidnapped, and then he returned to the Pawtuxet in 1614, and then he was captured again, and that's when he was getting ready to be sold into slavery right here. And it was actually friars from England that found him, and they bought him and several others, and eventually they took him back to England. And he escaped and went here, and then they brought him back. And then he finally talked them into letting him return to his village in 1619, so here he was. So all of these things happened. In the meantime, Squanto's becoming fluent in English, you know, and he's also learning Christianity. So there's the backdrop of all the different things that happened prior to the Pilgrims. Now let's dig into the Pilgrims. The Separatists, they went to Scrooby. Their primary, one of their leaders was William Brewster, and he was the person who had owned this manor. Eventually, they became persecuted at Scrooby, Scrooby's kind of like when you look at England, or you look at Great Britain, it's over to the west and a little bit up from being south. I probably should have put a map on there for you. Well, actually, I think I probably show you off this map. So Scrooby, I think, is somewhere around up here. Is that what you think, Dan?
I never located it.
I think it's right around up here is where it's at. So eventually, they became persecuted even in Scrooby because they moved out of London to have this place. And there was a group of them that had gone to jail and suffered persecution. So they decided they wanted to move to Amsterdam. And the reason why they decided they wanted to move to Amsterdam, a primary reason, was because they were very tolerant of the different religions. The government was. So they had said you couldn't leave England, even if you didn't agree with their policies and whatnot. You couldn't leave. Okay, you just had to conform. Right, you were a subject and you were going to work for the king. Period. Right. So they tried to manifest an escape, and they were betrayed by the person who was supposed to take them. The person took money, I believe, if I remember correctly, and then in a second attempt in 1608, they were able to get out, but a lot of the women and children were left behind. Ultimately, 150 made it over to Amsterdam. They ended up, they went to Leiden, and eventually they relocated over to Holland. I think they spent about 12 years in Holland. Isn't that about right? Do you remember? I believe they spent about 12 years in Holland. At first, they really enjoyed it because of the tolerance, and they were free from all of this persecution. Well, what ended up happening was they started getting older, and their children became more and more secularized by the culture of the area, which tended to be more free, tended to have a lot of free thinkers. Right? And they were concerned that their entire ideals and way of life would end up becoming extinct because the next generation didn't seem to be following in that footsteps. So eventually they decided, like, we need to move out of Holland and we need to go to the New World. England wasn't an option because they didn't feel that they had the freedom of the religion in England. Another big issue too was, though, you remember the 80 Years' War? Mm-hmm. You remember I said pay attention to that date, 1621? Well, they left in 1620 because guess what? That 12-year truce was now wearing thin and the war was looming. The drumbeats of war were on the horizon. So they didn't want to be part of that either. So their strategy to relocate to America. When you're going to travel all the way from England to America in these wooden ships, okay, you want to have at least 2 of them with you. The reason being is when one goes down, you can hop on the other one, right? You don't want to have to go across that ocean with just one ship. Another thing was they needed to secure financing in order to do this operation. They didn't have enough money to proceed with this financing themselves. Well, what would happen is people would say, hey, I'll invest in this, and then here's what you have to pay me back out of it. And that was known as a charter. Well, this charter they were having all kinds of problems with the charter. It began in June, and they wanted to leave in the summertime because nobody in the right mind would want to cross the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the winter. That's when you have the worst storms that are happening. Plus, you're going to go into a land, and you want to be able to do what you can to prepare for the winter. You don't want to just start off in the winter. However, what ended up happening was these negotiations kept falling through and being stalled. And eventually, they finally got the negotiations completed sometime around July or August. So they ended up hiring a boat called the Speedwell, and then they had another ship that Speedwell was going to meet up with called the Mayflower. Well, the Speedwell began leaking right off the bat. As soon as they journeyed from Holland to England, the Speedwell had already leaked. They hadn't even left England yet. So they brought it in and they had to spend time doing repairs on the speedwell. And then they left again on August the 12th and the speedwell leaked again. And then they brought it back. And then they left again. This time they went 300 miles into the Atlantic and the speedwell began leaking again. And they decided we have to turn back around and go back again. Now, you would think that a mission that's being of people who are so given themselves over to God would be blessed by God, where you wouldn't have a ship that's sinking 3 separate times and your voyage is being delayed, right? But you know what? God was working through that also, as we will see. So, frustrated with the amount of time that they lost, they finally said, you know what? We're leaving the speedwell behind. It was later learned, this is from Dan's comments, which I'm very grateful for that he'd given me some of his notes on it, by the way. It was later learned that the speedwell was sabotaged by its crew to get out of the year-long commitments. I never read that, so I found that really interesting. Thank you, Dan. So, out of the 121 combined passengers, 102 were chosen to travel on the Mayflower, and the supplies were then consolidated, and they finally set sail on September the 6th, 1620. There was a lot of talk about just canceling the whole trip. Like, this doesn't seem to be working out for us. It's a bad time for us to leave. But, you know, there was so many. Where were they supposed to go? They were persecuted in England. War was on the horizon in Holland. They had already invested much of their own money and stuff to do this. So there was about half of them, I think, that did stay behind and didn't go. And there was another half of them that said, you know what? I'm just going to go. I will put my trust in God. Well, during the voyage, which was a terrible, terrible voyage, it was a terrible voyage. It began okay, but it didn't take long, about halfway through or a third of the way through the trip before they started hitting those storms. Before all of that happened, there was this guy who was just giving them all kinds. The sailors in those days were really they were probably like your worst kind of atheists. Okay, worst kind. Drinking, angry, belligerent atheists. So, according to William Bradford, he says, one sailor described by William Bradford as a proud and very profane young man of a lusty, able body, which made him even more haughty, was particularly nasty. He would always be condemning the poor people in their sickness and cursing them daily with grievous execrations. He did not let them that he hoped to help to cast half of them overboard before they came to their journey's end and make merry with what they had. The mild, peace-loving exiles simply did not know how to cope with such a character. The leaders, such as John Carver and William Brewster, gently reproached him, but this only made him curse and swear and taunt the passengers even more bitterly. They were at sea a little more than 2 weeks before they came half seas over, in William Bradford's phrase, when this proud, profane young man was inexplicably stricken with a sudden disease, and in the space of a few days, perhaps even hours, he died in a desperate manner, raving and cursing to his last breath. On this trip, nobody died except for this young man, which is fascinating. And one child was born. So one was lost and one was found. So they finally saw land on November the 20th. They came, and actually I want to relate to you an experience, and I'm not sure where it's at in the notes, but it's in there. The storm got so bad at one point that the center beam that holds the two sides from caving in, okay? The center beam was getting pushed so hard that it was bending down and it eventually broke. And water was coming in on the sides of the boat. And it looked like, even to the sailors who were hardened and used to seeing pretty rough things happen at sea, it looked like they weren't going to survive this trip. Luckily for them, somebody had brought what they call a screw, which was used for house building. And they used that screw, they put it up underneath the beam, and they screwed it up, and they managed to bring the beam back into place. And then some carpenters brought some posts in, and they managed to secure all of this to get the ship to be able to continue to sail. But that's how bad it was out there. This thing was being tossed completely sideways and fro. They had to take their sails down several times, and just wherever it's going to take us, it takes us. Because if they would have left the sails up, it would have ripped the sails to shreds. That's how bad it was for them coming over. Their food, their rations became so short. Many of them were becoming sick. The bread that they would eat, you couldn't even bite into the bread. You couldn't bite into the bread. It was like rock. You had to wet it down in order to eat it. And many of them weren't even allowed to come up on deck for a very long time to even see the sunlight because it was so bad. Well, they finally land, and that was November 20th. And so here's a 66-day voyage from England to the New World. And where they're supposed to land was right over here in the Hudson Bay area. Mm-hmm. And where they end up at, because of the winds and the storms and all that, was up above the Hudson Bay area around Cape Cod. So you can see from this here that they actually tried to go down, but what happened was this time of year, the water in that area becomes so bad that it's actually incredibly dangerous to sail down past there. So they tried to do it, they tried to sail through it, but they couldn't. And that's what's shown here also in a closer up view. So they tried to get out of this area and sail down into there. Mm-hmm. Well, lucky for them, they didn't, because where they were planning on landing, the Indians were actually hostile at the time. So, and if they had left on time and not had those 3 times where the speedwell had set them back, they would have been able to easily get to their location. But the speedwell set them back and put them into this location, which was not an easy location to be going into in the wintertime, however, but turned out to be a pretty good thing in the end. Well, because they were now in a different area than the charter had already prescribed, a lot of the colonists felt, especially the ones that weren't part of the Pilgrim community, because there was actually some people who were part of it and some people who weren't, they were like, well, we can just do whatever we want. So they said, you know what, we're not landing until everybody decides to agree on what we're going to do when we get here, because united we stand, divided we fall kind of policy here. So they created what was the Mayflower Compact, which is really kind of like the very first seed to the Constitution. And in the Mayflower Compact, you see that's given to God, that in the name of God, amen, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. This is why they came here. This is why the United States was founded. And this was their purpose in their life. And then you can read how they came together as a civil body politic. So in their first landings, go back here to this map. They initially had landed kind of anchored right around here. So from there, they had this one chaloupe, or maybe even a couple of them. But they had a chaloupe that it was a small ship or small little boat that they could get in, because the water was too shallow for the Mayflower just to go around the area. They had to find a place that made sense for them to land on, that made sense for them to habitate for the winter, right? They didn't have time to clear land. They didn't have time to forage for food, all that kind of stuff. So they went down through here and looked around. They couldn't find any place. And eventually they ended up finding Plymouth. And guess what Plymouth was? The land was cleared because it had already been farmed by the Indians who had been living in the area. Well, they encountered these European and naval built mounds and graves. They found all these skeletons, around the ocean because of all the people that had died. And it was really harrowing for them to look at this and say, what the heck's going on? And where is everybody? Right? And eventually they found these mounds of seeds and grain and beans where the Indians had stored this stuff for the winter. And that ended up providing for them sustenance to get through the winter. The Indians had died in the plague. But I guess there was some Indians that were still utilizing this place, I guess, apparently for burying their stuff. So their very first contact with the Indians They ended up getting into, they at first saw him, and then eventually the Indians came back and they started shooting arrows at him. They fired muskets at him, and then they took off, and that was the end of that. And then Squanto shows up, and this guy shows up into camp wearing practically nothing in the middle of the winter, by the way. And I guess your body can get used to that. I don't know. Anyhow, he comes in there and he starts speaking great English, and they're astonished, and he helps them get through the winter and helps them with their corn and planting. Out of the 102 pilgrims that had gone, only half of them survived into the spring. In fact, it got so bad in the wintertime that there was only six of them, or around six, that were even healthy to take care of the other 100 or so. And they took care of them and got them into health. But it was really a terrible, terrible winter.
Why didn't they go to Florida?
Yeah. Talk about some tough Indians. Those, I think those, I'm forgetting the name. I know the name is like the Florida football team has their name. Seminoles, right? Yeah, I think they're one of the only tribes that have never been conquered by the white man. So, never officially conquered. Yeah.
That's how it started Thanksgiving, something like that, or that's a different story?
This is how Thanksgiving started, yes. What ended up happening was then eventually the next fall they had a great harvest, and the Indians came to their harvest, and they had they played games and ate, and it happened for several days, just like in the Feast of Sukkot. I don't know exactly how many days. The Indians went into the woods and they captured they shot a bunch of deer and brought the deer. They didn't eat any turkey, okay, like we do. All right, they ate crabs and lobster and pheasant and stuff like that.
Even they knew turkey makes you sleepy.
Probably deer as well.
Let's look at the, in closing, let's look at this, the philosophy and the theology of the guiding pilgrims. First of all, they had a philosophy of tolerance, which was very unusual. In fact, most people, it's kind of a myth nowadays that the Pilgrims were not tolerant. They're actually conflating that with Puritans. The Puritans were very intolerant. The Puritans were, extremely dogmatic. It's my way or the highway. It was the Puritans, with the witches of Salem and that kind of stuff. It wasn't the Pilgrims, okay? The Pilgrims were actually tolerant. And that was in large part due to their pastor who had preached tolerance. And one of the things that he had preached is the fact that man is fallen. And so that even if you have this doctrine, you believe that your doctrine is 100% correct, there is still the possibility that you're wrong because you're a fallen creature. So nobody's doctrine is 100% correct. And that's where they kind of came from. But they also were that class that was always persecuted and people had such little tolerance for. So when you come out of that class, you tend to have more tolerance, right? So tolerance of other people's religions was something that was just unheard of. Whoever owned the area or owned the state, that was the religion. And if you didn't abide by that religion, you got out or you got persecuted or you were a second-class citizen. And it was even that way in the United States for most places. It's even Massachusetts, by the way. The founder of Rhode Island, who was a Baptist, was driven out of Massachusetts by the Puritans. So it just shows you that even a Protestant religion was not accepted amongst Protestants if you weren't the right Protestant religion. It took a while to really begin to take hold of the idea that that it's your conscience. The great accomplishments require great difficulties. This was kind of like a theme of theirs that if by undergoing all of these they knew they were going to undergo these difficulties, and they were prepared for it mentally. They knew that it was a great accomplishment that they were doing, but they also knew, they also understood that there would be great trials in trying to achieve this great accomplishment, and that's an important philosophy. It's one that we don't have today in the United States. We got the easygoing philosophy. Well, God can't be in it if I'm having a hardship. Well, you know what? Maybe God is in it. And maybe God's sanctifying you and really going to make something great come out of it. Another thing was capitalism. Capitalism. They brought capitalism over. The Netherlands are actually the founder of the stock market. Wall Street is actually named after the street in the Netherlands where the stock market was created. That's how Wall Street got its name. Okay? This expedition was formed by capitalists with a charter, and the Pilgrims eventually paid back this money in beaver pelts and other things. What they did, though, with the charter was they set up an economic organization. Let me just read this to you. Bradford's greatest achievement was the revision of the colony's economic organization in 1623. Spurred by hunger, the colonists worked hard in the fields during their first year. But in the succeeding years, it became more and more difficult to get them to put their best efforts into the essential task. Bradford decided that the reason was the stipulation in their contract with the London merchants that everything in the colony, including the crops, was held in common for 7 years. This crude communism was destroying individual enterprise. Boldly, on his own authority, Bradford abandoned the arrangement and announced that henceforth every family would raise its own corn. Plymouth never went hungry again, and Bradford proved that vanity of that conceit, that they were taking away property and bringing into the community, into a commonwealth, would make men happy and flourishing. In other words, this system doesn't work. We have to allow people who work hard to be rewarded with the fruits of their labor. And that's capitalism. And then democracy. One of the big things that the Pilgrims had is they thought that as a congregation, we need to seek the mind of Christ. And so what they would do is many times they would put things out to a vote because they wanted to seek the mind of Christ. And that was sort of a form of democracy that had enveloped into the group. In summary, I want to leave you with, just to give you a look here about this is a replica of the Mayflower, which stands in Plymouth today. If you ever have a chance, go there. I took my sons there several years ago. It's quite an experience. You get to walk on it and see it. You can see it's not a very big ship, especially to hold hundreds of passengers. They pretty much stayed underneath here, hundreds of passengers for 66 days. In summary, I'm going to leave you with William Bradford's words. If I can get to it. It lets me. Here we go. As one small candle may light 1,000, so the light kindled here has shone on to many, yea, in some sort to a whole nation. We have noted these things so that you might see their worth and not negligently lose what your fathers had obtained with so much hardship. It wasn't easy for them. It wasn't easy for them. They lost half of their loved ones. William Bradford's wife, when he came back from that initial expedition, she had fallen overboard. Some people think that she committed suicide and just threw herself into the sea because it was so terrible, the experience. They had to fight the Indians at times, which I didn't talk about. Squanto was taken as a captive, and they went and they found out where he was taken and fought with them and eventually negotiated his release. They went through the hardships of winter. When they landed in the land, they couldn't light fires when they first landed because they didn't know what was going on with the Indians. When they took those sloops, when they took them onto the shore, they couldn't bring them totally onto the shore. You see how cold that is outside there? Picture going in water and pulling all of that forward, because that's what they had to do. They had to jump into the water. And they didn't have the warmth of a fire that they could light to warm themselves. And they made it through that winter. The troubles that they had in England, the troubles that they had in Holland, their voyage to come over here, the troubles in the New World. And yet they wanted to do it so that they could create what we're living in today. And boy, would they be happy in many regards, in regards to the fruit of the nation. But in regards to Thanksgiving today, I'm sure that they would want you to be looking to God and thanking God for what He's provided and how God had provided this place for them. And like I said, they endured that hardship, but they looked to God the whole time. And I think it's amazing. Go back maybe if you have a chance and review the notes now that you hear all the story. It's amazing how all those sequence of events, from the Gutenberg press to the enlightening of the minds of the people, to the plague, to the wars that were happening, all fit in to cause the Pilgrims to come to this one specific place and to create this nation. So, praise God, who's sovereign in all of his ways and his purpose, that while we're enduring hardship, if we can trust that he's holding us in the palm of his hand, that in the end, everything's going to be just the way it was meant to be. And so we'll put our faith and our trust in God. Lord, I just ask for you to be with us and remind us of these incredible truths of your sovereignty, of your will in our lives, of the trials and the hardships that people have endured for us to be able to live in our today's prosperity, and for us to give thanks to you. All of these things, Lord, you did for us. In the name of Jesus.